When people talk about their dream car, it's often a hypercar with a billion horsepower or high-tech self-driving cars. For me, it's without question the Toyota Bellfire minivan, but they don't offer this in the US. So my second dream car is a 1980s era family station wagon.
No other wagon gets better mileage around town than the Honda Civic Wagon.
And now I finally have one. I picked up this 1983 Honda Civic Wagon, and it's almost perfect. The body is straight and it's all original, but it doesn't run. And instead of fixing the engine, I'm gonna make it electric using this Nissan Leaf. The plan is to strip every useful electrical component out of the Leaf and transplant it into the wagon. That means the battery pack, traction motor, inverter, and everything else. Other people have done it, and I've watched those people do it on YouTube, and I'm choosing to treat it as an equivalent to having done it myself. If you've been thinking about doing the same conversion, stick around because this is the first episode of what's going to be a multi-part series. The first thing before I touch anything is charging the car overnight. Not to drive it since it's getting torn apart the next morning, but because I'll be wiring everything up with a new vehicle control unit on the bench, and having a full battery will likely be helpful. The car came with 50% state of health, which means roughly half the original pack capacity. The previous owner also threw in a few extra battery modules as part of the deal, which was a nice bonus. Whether those modules are actually good cells or quietly degraded ones is something I'll find out once I get everything on the bench. But I'm optimistic.
You sure about that?
Before anything comes apart, the parking actuator has to be disabled. The gear unit has a mechanical park lock built into it, and if you pull the motor out with the lock engaged, the output shaft won't spin. And I want to make sure that everything can move freely so it's easier to diagnose if something isn't working right during testing. So the fix is to put the car in neutral and unplug the actuator so it stays disengaged. It sits on top of the gear unit, and if you have noodle arms like me, it's actually pretty accessible from the top of the engine bay without much disassembly. There are 3 plugs on the actuator, and I wasn't totally sure which one controlled the lock, but the most efficient approach was unplugging all of them. A warning light came on, which I took as confirmation that something had changed, and to make sure, I turned the car off and gave it a push and noticed that it rolled back and forth freely, so that's good. The first thing to come out is the 12-volt auxiliary battery. Luckily, it's just a couple 10mm bolts securing the tie down, and this one has a built-in handle, so I'm not relying on just my fingertip strength to lift it out. And in the back seat, there's an unassuming little panel that lifts up and exposes a metal panel held on by 3 bolts. Underneath it is the high voltage service plug. Pulling this physically disconnects the high voltage circuit, which means I could take apart the rest of the car without the fear of blowing myself up and leaving my wife and daughter with a mess in the garage. I definitely don't want to lose this thing, so just in case I forget, I filmed myself putting it in a safe spot in my toolbox, which is also in dire need of organization. I'm thinking it's better to start fresh and upgrade the toolbox to a larger one. That way I can organize everything, plus make room for more tools. To get proper access to the powertrain, the whole front end comes off. The wheels come off first, then the fender liners. For extra safety, I like to put the wheels under the car just in case the jack stands decide to fail. The liners are mostly plastic push clips, and I got the majority of them out without damaging it. And then I just cut off the main section with shears since the liner isn't going back in the car anyway. And once the liner is out, I could get to the bolts holding the bumper to the fender and disconnect the fog light plugs. The top plastic panel comes off last with more plastic clips. And then the bumper pops free and I could set it aside. Then you can take off the whole charging port assembly, which looks simple to remove from the outside. There are 4 visible screws to take off the outer shroud, and underneath the shroud there are at least 50 more screws. And once you get all of those out, there's a boarding cable running to the door release, and that needs to come off before the whole contraption will actually release from the car. Then we can unplug the charging port cables and place them somewhere safe. With the front end cleared, I could get to the bumper bar and the core support. My main strategy here is simple: unplug every connector and remove every bolt that I can reach. And also drain all of the coolant in both cooling systems. With the core support out of the way, the inverter is the first component to come out and also the easiest of the 3 main high voltage units to access. Before I disconnected anything, I labeled the high voltage cables because they look identical and I want to make sure I put these back in the correct order. And a quick note on why I went with the first gen Leaf over the newer models. The later Leafs have the motor, inverter, and power distribution module all integrated into one assembly called the stack. It's compact, but it also means that you're locked into that geometry when you try to mount it in a different car. Though I think you can separate it, but it just takes a little bit more work. The first gen Leafs keep those components separate and gives me the flexibility to mount them however the Civic Wagon's engine bay actually allows. The other reason is that the first gen Leafs on Marketplace are basically free, and I'm not one to pass up on a reasonably priced item. The DC to DC converter was the biggest pain in the whole teardown. It's mounted vertically on the backside of a beefy bracket, so there isn't room to just unbolt the converter and pull it out without running into the firewall. The next logical step is to unbolt the bracket itself and take it out as a unit, except the bracket is undermounted to the frame rails, which means I can't lower it to clear the mounting points without running directly into the traction motor. So the path of least resistance was to cut the mounts off the frame rails and pull the whole assembly out with the hoist. This definitely wasn't the intended procedure described in the maintenance manual, but it came out. Getting the traction motor out meant pulling the axles first. The front suspension is the same layout as any other ICE front-wheel drive car, so it's just a matter of disconnecting everything at the spindle and pulling the axle free from the gear unit. One of the best tool purchases I've ever made has been this 1/2-inch impact gun. It makes quick work of getting all the nuts and bolts off the suspension, even the axle nut, which is notoriously a pain if you're using a regular wrench. After the axles were out, I put the suspension back together loosely so the shell could still roll around the garage on its own wheels. And that ended up being useful later when I needed to move it out of the garage to take it to the scrapyard. Removing the traction motor itself was really straightforward and almost anticlimactic after the DC to DC converter situation. All 3 motor mounts were easily accessible, and after taking the bolts out, the motor lifted out easily with a hoist. I was suspicious the whole time, but it was genuinely that simple. Before the battery pack, I pulled a few extra pieces: the electronic power steering column, the accelerator pedal, and the brake booster. Most people doing this conversion swap in a Prius EPS column and a Tesla iBooster because both of these work in a standalone failsafe mode without needing CAN bus signals from the original vehicle. The Leaf's EPS and brake booster need these signals to function correctly from what I've read, which is why most conversions don't bother with them. I pulled the Leaf parts anyway because I want to give them a shot and see if I could get them to work. In worst case, I'll just grab a Prius column and an iBooster off eBay, but I figured it was worth trying before junking them. The battery pack is the last major item. It spans the full underfloor of the car and weighs over 600 pounds. The plastic covers are held in with a bunch of 10mm screws, and once those come off, you can really appreciate just how massive the pack is. The connectors for the high voltage cables and the BMS sit at the front of the pack, and you want to make sure to get these out of the way before dropping the battery pack. The pack is secured to the body of the car with M12 bolts. There are 3 on the driver's side and 3 on the passenger side, as well as this bracket that's located at the back of the pack. I used 2 floor jacks with moving dollies set underneath the battery. Once all the bolts are out, you ease both jacks down evenly and slide the pack out from under the car on dollies. The task wasn't as daunting as it looked, and if you drive a Leaf and you're looking to swap your own pack, this is definitely DIY-able in a home garage. And everything that I didn't need, the bumpers, plastic panels, and everything else, went inside the shell, and I called the junkyard to come pick it up. And I was surprised they paid me $150 for it. I was fully expecting to pay them to tow it away. If you're interested in the cost of the build, leave a comment down below, and depending on how much interest there is, I'll make a full video breaking down how much I spent on the entire conversion. And here's everything that came out of the Leaf. The battery pack, and next to it is the charger, which was mounted behind the rear seats, but I forgot to film it. But it was just a few bolts and connectors, nothing crazy. Then the EPS column, brake master cylinder, traction motor and gearbox, and in the bucket is the PTC heater and water pumps, high voltage cables and axles, the DC to DC converter, and then the inverter. Before the wagon comes apart, I want to know exactly what I'm working with so I can figure out how everything's going to fit in and where. The next step is to measure the weights and 3D scan all the major components, and that is going to be in the next episode. Thanks for watching.